At some point you stopped asking certain questions. They did not disappear. They became inconvenient, and you are someone who knows how to deal with inconvenience. You buried them under routine, under obligation, under the reasonable logic of a life that needed to keep moving. And it worked, for a while, then for longer than a while. And yet here you are. The questions came back, slowly. So slowly that you almost mistook the weight of them for your own personality. A vague dissatisfaction with things that, by any external measure, should be enough. A suspicion that somewhere in the process of building a functional life, something more essential got quietly traded away. Simone de Beauvoir was not interested in comfort. She was not constructing a philosophy to help people feel settled inside the lives they were already living. What she was doing, across decades of writing, living, and watching the people around her, was something far less welcome. She was mapping the exact ways in which a person dismantles their own existence from the inside, methodically, calmly, while believing at every step that they are being perfectly reasonable. That map is what we are going to follow. Beauvoir inherited a concept from Sartre and did something Sartre never quite managed. She grounded it in the actual texture of a human life: bad faith. The idea that a person, fully aware of their capacity to choose, arranges their existence as though that capacity were never available to them, as though the shape of their life arrived from outside, from circumstance, from temperament, from the particular hand they were dealt, and their only honest role was to adapt to it. It is a convincing performance, partly because it is directed at oneself. The internal logic of bad faith is airtight. It speaks in the language of self-knowledge. I know my limits. I know how I function. I know what is realistic for someone in my position. It sounds like maturity. It sounds like hard-won clarity. And that is precisely what makes it so effective. It borrows the vocabulary of honesty to execute something closer to its opposite. What Beauvoir was pointing at is not confusion or ignorance. The person living in bad faith is often highly intelligent. They can articulate their situation with considerable sophistication. What they cannot do, or will not do, is follow that articulation to its logical conclusion, because the logical conclusion implicates them. It places the full weight of their life's direction back in their own hands, and that weight, carried honestly, changes everything. That is the thought that divides a life in two, and it has nothing to do with motivation or resolve, or finally finding the right conditions. It is purely a matter of seeing, with enough precision and enough honesty, that the story you have been telling about why your life looks the way it does has always had your fingerprints on it. Beauvoir was not offering relief. She was describing a threshold. And the only question worth asking is whether you have crossed it, or whether you are still standing just before it, arranging reasons to wait. Freedom, in the way Beauvoir understood it, is not a reward. It is not something you arrive at after enough work, enough therapy, enough self-examination. It is the condition you were born into, permanent, inescapable, and for most people, deeply unwelcome. This is where her philosophy becomes genuinely uncomfortable. The modern understanding of freedom is transactional. You earn it, you build toward it. You accumulate enough stability, enough resources, enough self-knowledge, and eventually freedom becomes available to you as a kind of prize, something you can finally afford. This framing is enormously popular because it converts freedom into a future event, something to work toward rather than something to reckon with right now, today, in the life you are already living. Beauvoir had no patience for that framing. For her, freedom was not waiting at the end of anything. It was already present in every choice, every habit, every relationship you maintained or abandoned, every version of yourself you performed for the people around you. The question was never whether you had freedom. The question was what you were doing with it, and whether you were willing to admit that you were doing anything at all. Because the alternative, the position that your life has been shaped primarily by forces outside your control, is deeply seductive. It distributes the weight. It makes you a participant in your own story rather than its author. And there is genuine relief in that. A person who is not fully responsible for their life is also not fully accountable for it. And accountability, carried honestly, is one of the loneliest things there is. This is what Beauvoir understood that most philosophical treatments of freedom miss entirely. Freedom is not primarily a political or abstract condition, it is a psychological one. And the resistance to it is not intellectual, it is visceral. It lives in the body, in habit, in the automatic preferences and aversions that organize a life long before conscious thought gets involved. The person who genuinely confronts their own freedom does not feel liberated, not immediately. What they feel first is exposed, because if you are free, genuinely completely free, then every compromise you made, every direction you did not take, every version of yourself you abandoned for a safer one was a choice. And choices, unlike circumstances, belong to you. That is what the thought does. That is why it divides. Before the world had finished forming an opinion about you, there was something prior. Something that did not yet know how to justify itself, or perform itself, or defend itself. You have very little access to that. What you have access to is everything that came after. The version of you that was shaped by prolonged contact with other people's definitions of what a person like you should want, should value, should become. Beauvoir wrote extensively about this process, the way a human being absorbs the definitions of others and gradually mistakes them for self-knowledge. The child who is told, repeatedly and in various registers, that they are sensitive or difficult or practical or unreliable, that child does not simply receive information. They begin to organize their behavior around it. They construct a self that is legible, that confirms what the world already seems to know. And over time, that construction becomes so familiar, so automatic, so thoroughly inhabited, that it stops feeling like a construction at all. It feels like a fact. This is not a pathology. It is the ordinary mechanics of how identity forms under social conditions. But Beauvoir's point, and it is a sharp one, is that the ordinariness of the process does not make it any less consequential. A cage that everybody lives in is still a cage. The fact that it was built gradually without malice by people who were themselves inside their own cages does not change what it is. The self you call I is, in significant part, a response. A highly sophisticated, deeply personalized response to a set of conditions you did not choose and could not have anticipated. And that response has its own logic, its own internal consistency, its own ways of protecting itself from examination. It knows how to make itself feel inevitable. It knows how to convert its own limitations into personality traits. It knows how to look like the truth. What it cannot survive is a direct, sustained encounter with the question of whether it was ever really chosen. That question does not destroy a person, but it does force a reckoning with something that most people spend considerable energy avoiding: the possibility that the self they have been defending, explaining, and organizing their life around is less a discovery than a habit, less an identity than an adaptation, and that somewhere beneath the adaptation, there is still something that has not yet had the chance to speak. In 1949, Beauvoir published a book that made a significant portion of the intellectual world deeply uncomfortable. It was precise in a way that left very little room for dismissal, the kind of precision that is, in its own way, more destabilizing than any provocation. The Second Sex was not, at its core, a book about women. It was a book about what happens to a human being when an entire civilization decides, in advance, who that person is allowed to become. Beauvoir's argument was specific. A woman in the world she was describing did not simply face external obstacles, discrimination, limited access, social hostility. Those things existed, and she documented them. But beneath those external conditions was something more fundamental. A psychological architecture that had been constructed over centuries, designed to make a woman experience her own limitations as natural, as inherent, as simply the way things were for someone like her. She called it immanence, the condition of being permanently oriented toward the maintenance of what already exists, the household, the relationship, the social fabric, rather than toward the creation of something new, toward the world as it is, rather than the world as it could be. And her point was that this condition had been so thoroughly internalized over so many generations that it no longer needed to be enforced from outside. It enforced itself, from within. And that is precisely what makes her argument so difficult to contain within its original context. Because what Beauvoir was describing in the specific case of women is a mechanism that operates far more broadly than any single group, the internalization of a ceiling. The process by which a person absorbs the boundaries placed around them so completely that they begin to experience those boundaries as their own, as preferences, as temperament, as the honest recognition of their own limits. The cage becomes invisible because it has been moved inside. Every person reading this has experienced some version of that process. The specific content varies. The mechanism does not. And the question Beauvoir was really asking, the one that survives the particular historical moment she was writing in, is whether a person can look at that internalized architecture honestly enough to see where it came from, to stop experiencing their own conditioning as self-knowledge, to hold those two things apart, what was placed inside you and what you actually are, and examine the distance between them with something other than defensiveness. That distinction is one of the sharpest edges in her entire body of work, and it is the one that carries the strongest reasons to avoid, because seeing it clearly does not simplify a life, it complicates it. It removes certain excuses that were load-bearing, and a person who has organized their existence around those excuses will feel their absence immediately. There is something Beauvoir returned to across her work with unusual persistence, the question of what happens to a person when the encounter with others stops being a means of self-discovery and becomes instead the substance of the self itself. The person living inside that dynamic has learned, through years of precise social calibration, to experience themselves primarily as they are experienced by others. Their sense of their own competence rises and falls with external feedback. Their understanding of their own worth is not something they carry independently. It is something they read continuously from the faces and reactions of the people around them. And because this process happens automatically, below the threshold of conscious decision, it does not present itself as dependency. It presents itself as sensitivity, as attunement, as simply being someone who cares about their relationships. What it actually is, Beauvoir would argue, is a sophisticated abdication. The self that cannot exist without continuous external confirmation has, in a very precise sense, declined the project of existing on its own terms. It has outsourced its own coherence. And the cost of that outsourcing accumulates quietly in the decisions that get made to preserve a relationship rather than honor a conviction, in the versions of oneself performed for different audiences until the unperformed version becomes genuinely difficult to locate. It reveals itself only when the confirmation stops arriving, when the mirror goes dark and what remains is a person confronting, possibly for the first time, the question of who they are when nobody is watching. When there is no reaction to read, no approval to calibrate toward, no external structure holding the self in a recognizable shape. That confrontation is what Beauvoir considered the beginning of something genuine, not a solution, a starting point. The moment a person stops being primarily a reflection and begins, with considerable discomfort, the project of becoming something that exists independently of what it looks like to others. What has been examined so far is not a set of abstract philosophical positions. It is the description of something that is already operating in your life, in the specific ways you relate to your own freedom, in the self you have built from other people's definitions, in the confirmation you seek and the dependence that seeking creates. Beauvoir was not writing for academics. She was writing for people who lived inside these dynamics, people intelligent enough to recognize the description, but close enough to the material to feel the resistance that recognition produces. If this channel has been useful to you in that sense, if what is analyzed here is the kind of thinking you want to see more of, subscribing means you will be here for what comes next. And what comes next in this video is the part most people find hardest to absorb. Because everything examined so far has been, in a sense, diagnostic, a mapping of the terrain. What follows is the question that terrain raises, the one Beauvoir spent her life exploring, the one that gives this video its title, the one that, once truly encountered, does not leave a person where it found them. The question is not who you are. The question is who you have been choosing to be, every day, in the specific, ordinary, unremarkable decisions that accumulate across a life. And whether the person making those decisions has ever been fully present to them, or whether they were made, as most choices are, in a kind of managed inattention. A state in which the choice happens, but the one choosing remains carefully, a little removed from the full weight of what they are doing. Beauvoir called this the refusal of transcendence, the decision, repeated, habitual, rarely conscious, to remain within the boundaries of what is already known, rather than moving toward what is genuinely possible, to maintain rather than create, to manage rather than risk, to stay inside a life that fits rather than build one that is truly yours. And the confrontation she was pointing toward is not with your circumstances, not with your past, not with the people who shaped you. It is with the part of you that was complicit in all of it, the part that knew at various moments that there was a different path and chose, for reasons that seemed reasonable at the time, to remain exactly where it was. Choosing in the way most people practice it is a heavily managed process, and the management is so familiar that it has long since stopped feeling like management. It feels like judgment, like maturity, like someone who has learned, through experience, how to make a decision without catastrophizing it. Beauvoir's problem was not with the act of deciding. It was with the invisible perimeter inside which every decision gets made. The preferences you trust, the possibilities you consider worth considering, the sense of what is available to someone in your position. That entire apparatus was assembled under conditions you did not choose, by influences you did not select, during a period when you were absorbing your world's conclusions about what a person like you could reasonably expect. And a choice made inside that apparatus, without any examination of the apparatus itself, is not as free as it feels. This is the point where Beauvoir's philosophy becomes genuinely demanding, because she is not suggesting that your choices have been wrong, or that your life has been wasted, or that the preferences you have developed are false. She is suggesting something more structurally uncomfortable than any of that genuine choosing requires, as a precondition, a degree of awareness of the conditions under which the choice is being made. And that awareness is precisely what the mechanisms examined in this video, bad faith, immanence, the outsourced self, are designed in their various ways to prevent. A person in bad faith does not experience themselves as avoiding choice. They experience themselves as being realistic, as understanding their situation clearly, as making the best of what is available. The avoidance is invisible to them because it has been incorporated into their understanding of reality itself. The ceiling has become the sky. What genuine choosing looks like in Beauvoir's framework is considerably less comfortable than the managed version. It involves holding the full weight of a decision without distributing that weight across circumstances, other people, or the logic of how things have always been done. It involves the specific discomfort of recognizing that you are, at this moment, the author of what happens next, not partially, not in collaboration with fate or history or the particular hand you were dealt, but directly and completely, and that the direction you choose will say something about you that cannot be explained away after the fact. That is an exposure most people spend their lives engineering around. And the engineering is so thorough, so habitual, so thoroughly integrated into the texture of daily life, that it rarely presents itself as engineering at all. It presents itself as wisdom, as knowing your limits, as being, finally, someone who has stopped being naive about how the world works. Beauvoir's response to that presentation was unambiguous. The person who has made peace with their own limitations without ever genuinely testing them has not achieved wisdom. They have achieved a very stable, very convincing, very comfortable form of self-abandonment, and the comfort of it, the genuine relief of no longer being in conflict with the life you're living, is exactly what makes it so difficult to disturb. The thought that divides a life in two is the moment that comfort becomes visible for what it is. There is something I find genuinely difficult about Beauvoir, and it took me a long time to admit it. Her work does not leave you with a direction. It leaves you with a weight, the weight of seeing with uncomfortable precision the distance between the life you are living and the life you are capable of constructing. And I think that weight is the point. She was not trying to move people forward. She was trying to make it harder for them to stay still. That, to me, is a more serious act than anything that calls itself inspiration. Beauvoir wrote near the end of her life that the hardest thing a person can do is take their own existence seriously, not in the sense of self-importance, but in the sense of full responsibility. The willingness to look at the life one is living, its shape, its directions, its omissions, and accept that it is, in its entirety, something one has been building, through action as much as through inaction, through what one pursued as much as through what one quietly abandoned, without ever formally deciding to do so. This is a demand that most people encounter once, recognize the weight of, and then find a way to manage. And there is nothing contemptible in that. The weight is real. The life that genuine responsibility demands is harder than the alternative. It offers no comfort of inevitability, no relief from circumstance, no buffer between you and the full consequences of your own choices. It is a life lived without the exits that bad faith provides, and those exits, whatever else they may cost, do provide something. They provide rest, a certain kind of rest that is difficult to give up once you have learned to depend on it. But Beauvoir's central question, the one to which all of her work continually returns, is that the rest is borrowed. That a life organized around the avoidance of its own depth accumulates a specific kind of debt. Not moral, not karmic, psychological. The debt of a person who spent years being slightly less present in their own existence than they were capable of being, and who will at some point, in some moment of quiet that cannot be scheduled or avoided, have to reckon with what that cost them. This video is not that reckoning. It cannot be. A reckoning of that kind does not happen in the presence of a screen. It happens in specific, private, largely unglamorous moments when the noise dies down and what remains is you, unmediated, unwitnessed, with nothing between you and the actual shape of your existence. What Beauvoir gave us was not a map to a better life. She gave us the tools to see the life we are already living with far more honesty than is comfortable. And she understood, with the clarity of someone who applied those tools to her own existence without mercy, that this kind of honesty does not produce immediate relief. It creates a threshold. What you do at the door is entirely your decision. In the end, that was precisely what she had been saying all along. If this reached you in some way, subscribe. The next one will not be easier. Thank you for watching this far. Until the next discomfort.